So the first thing that happened was Jerry Seinfeld had faith in the idea that this could be a promising opportunity, even though he had no idea where it was going. So he once said it best, of course he did, because he's Jerry Seinfeld. He said, "Seinfeld is something I learned to do because I was given the opportunity. Then the show spiraled off into this whole other entity that I knew I had to serve because it had its own desire to be something." And I feel like I love the vaguely spiritual bent of that, but he's also a very practical man. But he really did. He followed through on this, and I think this is such a good lesson for any of us in our lives, actually. When NBC approached him and asked him to do a show because they liked his stand-up comedy. This is extremely common even now and was really common back in the 90s. You'd do a stand-up special, you'd be on Carson and Leno and all of those places, and then the network would say, "Hey, do you have any ideas for a show?" So they came to him and asked him if he wanted to do a television show, and he said, "Absolutely." And then he went home and was like, "I have no idea how to make a television show. But I've said yes, and I'm gonna figure it out."
They had an entirely female staff of writers, which is awesome. Especially at that time, we still don't have that most shows, but really at that time, no one did this. And they just felt like, why wouldn't we have a bunch of women who are living in New York City and single? They really were all single and living in New York City, and they would literally go out at night, come back home, write down what happened to them, take it to work the next day. And in fact, I talk a lot about this in the book, but they had a whole system where they had a van that would pick them up in New York City to take them into work. Work was in Queens, and I guess that was just no one could possibly imagine getting all the way to Queens alone by themselves, from Manhattan at that time. So they had a van that picked them up from the transpo department at the show, and when they'd get in the van, they would all start talking about what happened to them, who went on a date, what happened, and they'd kind of go over it, and they actually called it van talk. And then they would get to the studio, Silver Cup Studios, right over the bridge, and now Michael Patrick King, their boss, is there, and now they would have what they called host chat. And this was kind of it was more formal than van talk, but less formal than work. So host chat was the name of that was because it was like when you watch a morning show and the hosts will kind of banter a little bit, like Kelly and Ryan. If you watch that, they'll kind of just be like, "Oh, how was your weekend? Blah, blah, blah." That's what that was. This was supposed to be just going over what they talked about in van talk, but with Michael. Then they started work. Okay, so they've already had 2 levels of group therapy by the time they've started work. And then they take everything that they kind of discussed from that and put it up on the whiteboard in the writer's room as possibilities for storylines. And then they'd start the real work of the day.